And he had people come up to him, Timothy Garton-Ash, and say, George Orwell, like, how did he know? Which is such an amazing line, because it shows the absolute prescience, the absolute clarity of vision that Orwell had when he was writing 1984.
Roger Moorhouse, welcome back to another episode of History Book Buffs, which in this installment, we're going a bit self-indulgent for me. What are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about George Orwell. And I wonder why we've chosen George Orwell. Why could that be a thing? Why is that loomed large this week, Antonia?
Is it because my book, Stalin's Apostles, has been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for political writing?
Wow. It might be that. I mean, it could be coincidental, but I think it might be that.
Yeah.
And that is brilliant, by the way. I mean, it's a very significant, it's a big, a big prize for political writing. One of the biggest previous winners. The previous winner was Victoria Amelina, Ukrainian writer, posthumously, should be added. Hopefully that's not a bad omen. And Patrick Radden Keefe, whose current book is Riding High, London Falling. So it's a big noise. Congratulations, you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Honestly, it's completely overwhelming and completely amazing. At the risk of sounding like Gwyneth Paltrow on Oscar night. But it is particularly special because of the Orwell connection. I do not think it is possible to be a writer in English without owing a debt to Orwell, and especially not for those of us who write nonfiction with political themes. I think he is the godfather of everything that we do. And you and I wanted to talk about him and that legacy today from slightly a personal perspective and what he means to the work that we do. And we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to talk about his, him and his legacy in the worlds that we work in. And also we both went to one of his essays that we both separately had really admired, called Why I Write. And we're going to talk about that. So first of all, Roger Moorhouse, you obviously have spent much of your career writing about Eastern and Central Europe. Talk to me a little bit about his place in that world.
Yeah, it's not somewhere that he ever went. He died, relatively young. Not particularly well traveled for a man of his generation. I know he went to Spain and so on, but remarkably, in the world that he described in his writing and that he railed against, really, which we'll come on to in a minute, and that he described so sort of eloquently through, with Animal Farm, and then later, particularly with 1984, was one that was immediately recognizable to the people of Eastern Europe for, the second half of the 20th century, basically, and of course the Soviet Union. And there's a wonderful moment in, I think it was Timothy Garton-Ash, who was then a journalist, young historian who was over in Central Europe in the 1980s doing his research and basically sort of poking his nose into every meeting of Charter 77 and the dissident circles around Václav Havel and all that sort of thing. And he was in Berlin at the time as well. So he was very much in that world. And Uses of Adversity, which we've mentioned before on this podcast, he talks about those experiences. It's a fascinating book. But one of the things that he mentions is that he would get random people, come up to him in the street. And by that time, sort of 1984 had been published in Samizdat, so as a underground publication, right, on this onion skin paper. It was really cheap paper, been published in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, because it had been banned before. And he had people come up to him, Timothy Garton-Ash, and say, George Orwell, like, how did he know? which is such an amazing line, because it shows the absolute prescience, the absolute clarity of vision that Orwell had when he was writing 1984, which, bear in mind, was finished essentially at the end of 1947, right? So long time before. But he absolutely correctly diagnosed the realities, the lies, the obfuscations, the persecutions of the communist world in Eastern Europe. And I think that is astonishing in itself, I would say. But what's to me more astonishing with Orwell is that, he was a man, he was very avowedly, very viscerally a man of the left, right? He was a socialist. He called himself a socialist, and yet he saw his confreres to further left than him and saw how evil they were with complete clarity, where so many others in the same political space as him couldn't, and were mealy-mouthed and said, well, maybe just Stalin's just sort of, getting things wrong, and the instinct is a positive one, and all that sort of nonsense that we talk about, we know about. But he saw it with absolute clarity, and I think that to me is what's astonishing, that he had the bravery, the moral bravery, and the political insight that he could do that.
One of the questions that I'm getting asked all the time about the Cambridge Five is about what they knew and didn't know about Stalin in the 30s. And in my book, I made it very clear that I think loads was known about Stalin in the 1930s. Then during the war, there's a process of forgetting because Stalin's our ally. And then after the war, we rediscover those crimes as if they're new. And I'm getting pushback from that all the time from people. And actually, I suddenly thought, one argument I haven't been using that I ought to be using is the fact that Orwell wrote Animal Farm in 1944, right? And in that, there is explicitly the Stalin pig, and there is explicitly the Lenin pig, and there's Trotsky, and there's the whole thing plays out in ways that if we only knew about Stalin's crimes after the war, he would not have been able to write, okay? He could only write Animal Farm in the way that he did because everybody knew at the end of the 30s that was what had been happening in Soviet Russia. It's just the revolutionary communists did not care. The other point about it is that when he went to try and get Animal Farm published in 1944, he couldn't get it away. None of the publishers would touch it because nobody wanted to be horrible to Stalin in 1994 because the Red Army was defeating Hitler at great personal cost. But one of the people who warned a potential publisher off Animal Farm is a man who is in my book. He's called Peter Smollett, who was a Soviet agent whose job was to spread the propaganda, whose job for the British was to be a propagandist for Stalin, effectively, to whitewash Stalin's crimes and reframe him as Genie or Uncle Joe. And Harry Smollett did such a brilliant job at making Stalin into a British hero that actually Soviet intelligence began to get really freaked out. They couldn't believe that the British could be so duped by Harry Smollett's kind of propagandizing about how brilliant Stalin was. And it was Harry Smollett, who was an old friend of Philby's, who knew Burgess, who was, supplying them both with secrets throughout the war. Certainly Burgess. It was Harry Smollett mixing and messing, and he was a Soviet agent. It's unbelievable. And yet I'm consistently being told by people who haven't done the work with me that I've got it wrong, that in the 1930s, it was just impossible to tell what a nasty piece of work Stalin was, and communism looked like a really great idea, and aren't they kind of noble, lovely chaps for being seduced by it? They just wanted to be kind, Moorhouse.
Be kind.
And it's...
that's
be kind, hashtag be kind.
Yeah, that doesn't quite have the cachet that it did 10 years ago. No, I'm absolutely right. And I think, if you go back even to the beginning of the war and the Soviet invasion of Poland, which is obviously something I've written about and have good knowledge of, that there was tremendous sympathy for the Poles in Britain at the beginning of the war. and which only kind of dissipates sort of really halfway through, particularly after the Grand Alliance 41, and the Soviet Union kind of takes that position as ally number one after 1941. But there's tremendous sympathy for the Poles, not only because it's well known what the Germans were doing to them, but also because they knew what the Soviets were doing. There were enough people getting out. There were enough, first-hand accounts. There's enough stuff, in the newspapers in Britain, and the same thing with the purges of the 1930s. The idea that we didn't know is ridiculous and just doesn't hold water at all. So yeah,
We
you're
knew all
right.
of it.
You're
It's
right
just
to
the
push
question
back
is
on that.
the question is how much you cared or not. So
Yeah,
Orwell is in Spain in the 1930s, and obviously anybody who's read Homage to Catalonia knows how much Orwell cared about the
yeah,
disintegration into violence and bestiality and terror. Kim Philby was in Spain, also reporting on the Spanish Civil War. He was absolutely fine with what
yeah.
they did to the Trotskyists. It wasn't a problem for him at all. And in fact, the man leading the Stalinist purges against enemies within Spain was one of Philby's handlers, a guy called Alexander Orlov, who had been handling Philby in London before and then ends up in Spain. And he's the guy who kind of takes away the spirits away all the Spanish gold to Moscow, but he's also the guy leading the persecutions. And this is what Philby had to say of Orlov, who was, the guy persecuting the Trotskyists. He says, Orlov, obviously he was ruthless, but when people were on his side, he was absolutely first rate. He was a very, very nice fellow indeed, an extraordinary man, but obviously prepared to torture and slaughter anybody.
Wow.
So, the difference between someone like Orwell, who's a democratic socialist, and someone like Philby, who is a revolutionary communist, is how reasonable you think it is to slaughter and torture anyone who gets in the way of your project.
Disagrees with you. Yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, you mentioned that about Homage to Catalonia and the Spanish Civil War, because that's Orwell's turning point, right? I mean, as you well know, he says actually in this essay that we're going to talk about, he says the Spanish War and the other events of 1936 to 7 turned the scale, and thereafter I knew where I stood. Every line of serious work that I've written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. So that's absolutely his kind of seminal moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one more point before we talk about the essay is that we did have a look in our backlist, if you like. We did a fantastic talk about a book called The CIA Reading Club, or CIA Book Club.
CIA Book Club, yeah.
CIA Book Club by Charlie English, which is about how powerful it was to the literature that that was coming out of the West, and how powerful it was when it was being smuggled across borders. Not just Orwell, but certainly Orwell too, when it was being smuggled across borders into places which were being repressed by totalitarian oppression. Because, the one of the central themes that Orwell comes back to again and again and again is the power of the truth and the destabilizing force of a lie. And if you're living in a society in which everything is based on shifting lies, which all totalitarian regimes are, to have the anchor of words that blazon with truth was incredibly important during the kind of long years of oppression.
Yeah, and of course, and this was a concept that that Václav Havel, of course, ran with. I mean, he wrote a brilliant essay in the 1970s called "The Power of the Powerless," which I would also recommend people to read. And his later memoir was called "Living in Truth," and he echoed that same sentiment that one of the great battles against totalitarianism when you're living in it, and even the kind of moribund, dead hand dying totalitarianism that he experienced in the 1970s and 1980s, one of the battles against it is the battle for truth. And he says, if you live in truth, if you disavow those lies, then that's a key part of the battle won. So he echoed Orwell absolutely in that sense. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he echoed Orwell also in the sense that every single political writer, and certainly every writer who's ever touched on totalitarianism post-Orwell, is echoing Orwell. In the same, just like everybody who writes fantasy, even if they believe themselves not to be a Tolkien-ish fantasy writer, is in the
Yeah,
shadow of Tolkien. It's the same thing. Even if you reject his premise, you reject him. You can't, his presence is towering.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so we're talking a little bit about his brilliant essay on Why I Write, which
yeah,
I thought was a wonderful. I came back to it. I loved it before, but obviously because we were talking about it, one of the things he talked about is the compulsion to write and
yeah,
how,
yeah,
and it sounds so pretentious, doesn't it? But people who know me know that I was a journalist for many years, and then I wrote 3 novels, and then I couldn't get published anymore because my novels didn't sell very well. And yet I kept writing.
mm,
I just couldn't. There was no way to stop because that's all I know how to do. It's all I want to do. It's all I've ever wanted to do. And it makes
yeah,
it sounds incredibly pretentious, but it is what it is.
yeah. So Orwell gives 4 main drivers for writers, right? Um,
Mm.
the first one being sheer egoism, which
Yeah,
might be a
okay, yeah.
little bit of that. Then the second one is, so he talks about he said it's humbug to pretend this is not a motive. It is, right?
It is,
Serious
although
writers, go on.
sometimes in a slightly backward sense. In order to write anything, you have to believe you have something worth saying, right?
That's very true. Yeah,
And so it is a projection of ego to believe that what you have to say is more valuable than what somebody else has to say. I think what is quite interesting, and you and I have talked about this, is how for some writers that bit comes easy. The belief in one's
mm,
ability to say something worth hearing to some writers comes incredibly easy. It does not
yeah,
come easy to me. It doesn't necessarily come easy to you. So that thing about
no,
ego, I agree. You have to have an ego, but some of us have to slightly fake it more than others
yeah.
until we start
I
believing
think
in it. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
I think that's true. I think that's very true. Um, and as you say, there are some for whom that side of things, the confidence to sort of put your voice out there, is a natural expression of who they are. And for the rest of us, sometimes we have to work at it. So sheer
Yeah.
ego is the first one. The
Humility.
second one
Yeah.
is aesthetic enthusiasm. Now, this would definitely be I think probably one of the 2 primary drivers for me. Perception of beauty, the aesthetic motive in words and in the rhythm of words and the use of why use a particular word in a sentence, why not another word. And it's one of those weird
I think
things
if
that
you,
when you try and explain it, that a lot of people don't really understand. And I think you're either a sort of word person or you're not. And
you
I've
just
always
said that
thought
you
that I
haven't
was.
got the word to describe how much you're a word person. Doesn't that not?
Yeah, I know. Well, it just shows you how unpretentious I am.
But yeah, I completely agree. There is definitely the glee with which I read back a sentence that I think
Mm.
works r- well is unmatched by almost anything that I do.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And it is that, you're just reveling in the words. And I know, I mean, um, there are, I think, comparatively few people outside of our sort of writerly world, um, that, if you, that kind of get that in a way. I mean, I know, for example, very often, like my wife, for example, will read stuff that I've written, and she says, "Oh yeah, that sounds good," and it's that element of why that word over that word, and about things like rhythm and so on, all of that stuff that we kind of take for granted, and you do it to some extent instinctively. It doesn't kind of register with, I think, a lot of people, which is kind of it. So it's that for me, that aesthetic element is really strong. The third one he mentions is the historical impulse, which I would also fall into that category. Being, the desire to sort of find out the truth, to lay something down for posterity in a way, to contribute something to the record. And I always feel that very strongly. In a lot of the books that I've written, I've always gone into them with the mentality of, wanting to either correct a myth or to expose, an area of history that is sort of underrepresented or underexplained. And it is that idea that you want to, contribute something to the record. It's as simple as that. So that's an element I think I feel very strongly. And the last one he mentions is political purpose, which obviously was a big driver for him. The idea to, push the world in a certain direction, as he puts it, that you want to effectively change the world. So where do you sit on those four drivers, Senior?
Well, I mean, we've talked about the first two. I agree. We've talked about ego. We've talked about the aesthetic. Couldn't agree more. The kind of glee of the words themselves. The historical impulse, 100%. That's been in everything I do, from the novels onwards. There's that sort of sense of I want to interrogate the history. I want to interrogate the standard version of things. I want to know what happened. I care deeply. I love the research as much as I love the writing on the novels as well as the books. I care very, very deeply and feel the historical impulse. And I think, again, it's one of those things, maybe you either, those of us who are totally passionate about history, most of us have held that since childhood. I've never, ever been passionate about anything in the same way that I'm passionate about history. In terms of the political impulse, this is more difficult now. This has become more difficult now, this one, because I think the problem is that I agree with Orwell's political impulse. My issue is now that maybe this is being misused as political activism, which is a different thing. Although, having said which, I mean, my book, I guess, is quite explicitly an anti-communist book. It's like it takes a position. So, yes. What he does say is you have to be incredibly aware of your own political bias, and I agree with that. I think one of the problems with the way a lot of modern history is written is that people are incredibly aware. They talk a lot about being aware of their own bias. They don't recognize when they're not being neutral about things, and they don't believe that bias can be eradicated, so they wallow in their bias rather than trying to correct for it. And I think that's where it becomes activism rather than political clarity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. There's another couple of aspects here where he mentions the process of writing a book. There's some lovely quotes in this essay. He says, close to the end, he says, this was published in 1946, by the way. He says, I hope to write another novel soon. He said, it's bound to be a failure. Every book is a failure. That novel that he's talking about was 1984, which was anything but a failure. Straight into the sort of canon of 20th century literature. And I would say fairly close to the top. But it's interesting how, that's the sort of thing that you and I would say late at night after one too many vodkas, that this book's going to be a failure. It is, isn't it?
Failure. But that feeds into my other favourite quote from the essay, where he says, all writers are vain, selfish and lazy.
Yeah.
I mean, okay. I feel seen, George.
Guilty as charged.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And there's another one where he says, writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness.
Listen, I completely agree with that. I think it's really hard, and people underestimate it, especially nonfiction. it's also not coal mining, so let's not get carried away.
No, that's very true.
There are other more difficult jobs, and
yeah,
you and I have both done some terrible jobs. I've sold encyclopedias door to door. I've sold chocolates to incredibly rich women in Holland Park for 15 hours of a day. Like this job is a joy and a fucking privilege.
It is a joy. Exactly. I don't want to overstate that thing about it being a miserable, horrible experience.
But it is hard.
It is hard. Yes, it is hard. It is hard, and it's kind of lonely, but I wouldn't do anything else. I can't do anything else.
No. One of the things he says as well, which I really love, is that you have to efface your own personality, and that good prose is like a window pane. And I think this is really, really, really important. As someone who takes their prose very, very seriously, I cannot cope when I'm reading something in fiction or non-fiction when the prose is so overblown that that's all you can see. When all you can see is the kind of flourishes, you can't get to the meaning because all you're getting is the style.
Yep.
And I tried very hard to be as pared back as possible.
Yeah, and it's kind of almost invisible.
One thing I will also
like a window pane. It's
almost invisible. Invisible like a window pane.
If your reader is getting pulled up all the time, interrupting themselves because they're going, why have they used those, that particular phrase, or that, if you're being dragged out of the moment because of the words, then that's the problem. And it's a little bit. I always think the analogy to a good football referee is one who you don't even notice is there. Like the game carries on and it flows, and there isn't a fight at the end, and there's no controversy. In a sense, the author is the same. You're if you've done a really good job, you are effectively invisible.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I will just also say, just briefly, on Animal Farm and its afterlife. All three of my kids have studied it at school, and the youngest one's doing it now. She's 11. And it's each of them, I've witnessed this unbelievable moment where they've been reading, for pleasure for years. They read stories that are one-dimensional as children, perfectly great stories. They've all been obsessed with like Narnia or whatever. But with Narnia, they never understood the layers. They just read it as a sort of, adventure story. And then they come to Animal Farm, and they are sophisticated enough now, because they're old enough to understand its allegorical nature and to witness how clever it is. And it's like a light bulb going off in their heads. And I've seen it with every single one of them. It's a light bulb moment of what literature can do, what words can do, what stories can do, what narrative can do, and how you can create layered bits of writing to explore incredibly complex ideas. And I think it's an amazing thing. I think just how many years hence, it's unbelievable this book still has its resonance and power.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's it's tribute to Orwell and his his skills as a writer, and his perspicacity, crucially. Like I said, that ability to be morally brave enough to sort of tell it like it absolutely was about totalitarianism, and then the writerly skills to be able to get it down on the page. I mean, genius.
Yeah, you need both. Exactly.
You need both. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great note upon which to end it. So yes, absolutely. As I said, right at the top of the canon of writers in the English language of the 20th century, George Orwell.
I thought you were going to say me. Oh, thanks.
Jury's still out on that one. But we are marking your shortlisting as a finalist in the Orwell Prize, which is brilliant, and I'm absolutely made up for you, and I'll be cheering from the sidelines and hope that you carry home the prize. Look forward to that. End of June, I think it was, wasn't it? It's getting decided.
It was. I won't tell the listeners that before we started pressing record, you went, "It's only your first book, you fuckhead."
don't tell them that.
No.
It was a kind of, it came from a place of
It was
love.
a backhand.
What can I say?
Anyway, on that note, thank you very much, Roger Moorhouse. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.